recording now, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel and on our website. So today's webinar, we're going to be discussing, talking a little bit about influence. Do I have any? So this is quite a broad topic. I'm going to explain a little bit in more detail as we get in there. But just to get started, for those of you who aren't as familiar with EZSigma, we do have a great passion for continuous improvement. Specifically, we specialize in Lean Six Sigma. However, we do offer a lot of different coaching, consulting, training in all sorts of topics. Specifically, you can see here, we also have some software programs that we offer to our clients. And our sister company, Bay 3000, specializes in project management and soft skills training. So again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm going to be discussing the topic. My name is Elizabeth Jamashak. I've been with EZSigma Group since 2006 in a variety of different roles. Over the last several years, I've had opportunities to broaden my skill set a little bit more into more leadership training. Also been doing some strategic planning, process mapping, and then doing some work with different boards, both as a chair and as a board member. So all of these experiences combined have really given me an opportunity to take a look at influence. And this has been a topic that I've been passively interested in for years, probably since high school, so nearly 25 years ago. And over the last several years, I've been taking a much more intentional look at influence. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, generally, when influence comes up, it's from the perspective of a leader. What kind of influence can a leader generate over their team or over a group of people? Often it's to bring about change. However, what we're going to do today is talk more about influence and more the ambient and passive influence that we can have just in our day-to-day lives, both at work and personally, and how what we do, say, believe can impact others and influence others. So as we go through this, I'd like you to keep a couple of questions in your mind just to be considering, because again, this is something that I hadn't really considered until recently about how I influence other people when I'm not in a position of power or authority. And so this is what I'm going to challenge you with, is to consider how much influence do you have over others at work, which is the typical way that we view influence. But I'd also like you to consider how much influence do others have on you at work? And is that something that you've really consciously considered or thought about as influence? Or is it just one of those intuitive things? Because something that I've been discovering is that a lot of what we're going to be covering today really is intuitive thinking. It's things that we recognize on a day-to-day basis, but maybe have never thought about putting a name towards it or thought that it's an actual thing, that it's something that's been studied. So at the end of this webinar, I'm going to provide you I'll let you know some of the books that I keep in my personal library. There's going to be some references. We have a course coming up on influencing without authority. So if it's a topic that you're as interested in as I am and want to dig a little bit deeper, we're going to give you lots of information that you can continue this. And again, because this is such a big topic, we're going to be scratching the surface, and I'm going to try and give you more of a broad overview with the hopes that it'll motivate and encourage, perhaps even influence you to take a little bit more or a deeper dive into this. So one of the key things I wanted to start off with was this idea of influence versus persuasion. Because often in the readings I've done, whether it's articles or books, these are often interchanged. However, there is a slight difference, which I do want to point out. Influence really is all about having an effect on someone, whereas persuasion includes an action. So it's getting someone to actually do something or believe something, whereas influence, it's like feeling the wind pushing against your skin, whereas persuasion is actually moving out of the way, going behind a building so that you no longer feel that wind, to give it a bit of an idea there. So who has influence? Typically, we think of leaders, politicians, teachers, managers. There's social media influencers, celebrities. Like I said, these are the ones that we usually think about as being influential in lives on a grand scale. However, today I'm going to pause it and hopefully give you a bit of an idea that anybody and everybody has influence. So as we go through this, for those that have been on a webinar with me before, I try not to put too much information on the slides. Today is going to be a little bit different. There's going to be a lot of information on here, so we are going to share this deck with all of you today, just so that you can have it as a bit of a reference. So I'm going to start with the conclusion that yes, you have influence outside of being in a leadership role or a position of authority or having any visual power. So you have influence as an introducer, whether that is in a formal networking setting, whether that's in a casual setting. By simply introducing two different people, there is that element of influence that gets put across when you're doing this introduction, that hey, you two might actually find something in common or might be able to work together, and it presets people's mind into thinking that this is potentially going to be something positive. As a listener in an audience, think about, for instance, comedians. When they're up on stage delivering their set, if the audience isn't laughing, then comedians will generally shift what they're doing or start to tell different jokes just to make sure that there's a reaction. So, and that can happen in team meetings. It can happen when you're going to see a show. It can even happen if you're in the audience for a concert. I mean, think about it. Many musicians will state that they get the energy from their audience, and that is what kind of pushes them forward. And so, once again, I'm just going to remind everyone, if you could just mute your background, your microphone, that would be great. So as a member of an audience or as a listener, you have some influence as to what's going on. As a questioner, there's an opportunity. If you ask a question, someone might be presenting a topic, or it might be you, the project leader, the team leader, discussing what is going to be happening. By asking specific questions, you can influence the course of the discussion, or you can influence the process, or even potentially what you're going to be working on. Again, as a team member, coming into a setting, you might be coming into that setting with a specific skill set that other people are aware of. Maybe you are an expert at process mapping, or maybe you are really good at risk mitigation. So just by simply sitting in the room with other people having that knowledge about you, that can influence, again, how the conversation goes, how the roles are displayed or distributed, what is going to be happening, and what is the type of project or thing that you're actually working on. And lastly, as a bystander, perhaps we've all encountered it. I know I have many times, for instance, in an elevator with a bunch of people where everyone's really quiet, no one's making eye contact, and nobody does anything until one person breaks the mold and they might say hi, or they might smile, and then everybody, it's like a collective breath is exhaled. And it's this idea that we often conform to the other people that are around us. And it's that saying, birds of a feather, which we're going to talk a little bit about as we get into this. So this is the end conclusion of today's webinar. And I want to dig into all these little topics and little ideas and give you some background as to this being more than just intuitive understanding of human behavior. Now, one thing that I do want to keep in mind is that as we learn more about people, as we understand behaviors of people, it can be tempting, or it can be easy to start to take advantage of that. However, I would like to make a statement that there is often a moral and ethical obligations that go along with this. So the more that you understand people, that doesn't mean that we want you to be manipulating people. So this is to use it in a positive way. So I'm going to ask, if you're comfortable, if you're willing, in the chat, have you ever tailored your questions or comments to suit the people that you are speaking with? And I'm just going to give everyone a moment, if you like to put in there if that's ever happened to you, just in the chat. And this, by the way, is a common phenomenon. And I know for me, for instance, going through a lot of sales training, this was something that was always promoted as being a very positive aspect of saying, hey, this is what you need to do to connect with people. And I'm not trying to say that this is a bad thing. This is a very common thing that happens. But often we don't always understand how much that not only impacts the people we're talking to, but how it can also impact us and what we believe and how we are perceiving a situation. So thank you for those that are putting some responses. So it looks like I'm not the only one, that a lot of other people have also done this. So again, as I mentioned, being an audience member, being a listener, there is influence. You do have influence on what's going on by shaping how the discussion is happening, by the decision that's going to take place. For instance, I remember several years ago, I ran into someone that I had gone to high school with. And just in the course of the discussion and catching up, they had made some offhand comment about how whenever I joined the group or whenever I started chatting with them, they would change their behavior. In this example, they would stop swearing because this person tended to do it a lot and they knew that I didn't. And so just something like that, it really, I was reminded of that incident in how I had absolutely no idea, completely oblivious to the fact that just walking up and standing near this person that I knew as a teenager had influence over their behavior. And so again, this is something that happens probably far more often than we realize or maybe care to admit. The idea of being in social situations and being impacted and comparing ourselves to other people, I think, is a very common idea. It's been around for a long time. It's similar to this whole idea of pluralistic ignorance, which I'm going to provide a definition for you a little bit later, the formal definition. And this can also manifest itself again in team meetings. For instance, if a request goes out to say, hey, who will work on this assignment, or we want someone to do this process mapping, maybe not anyone's going to say anything at first. There's often that bit of a dead silence until one person tends to put their hand up or say, yes, okay, I'll do it, or respond to a question or a request. And this, again, this is the idea where we're often comparing ourselves and thinking, well, if they're not going to do it, why should I do it? Or if they're not going to volunteer, I'm not going to feel comfortable volunteering. And it can really end up influencing and impacting everybody around. And this ties in as well to this whole idea that saying is believing, and which also connects with confirmation bias. And what confirmation bias is, essentially, it's this idea that when we believe something, we look for the information, the data, the opinions that support what we already believe. And what that can do is it can prevent us from being willing to look or accept another viewpoint or a different opinion or different sets of data if that's not what we already want. And there's been studies, many studies done on this whole idea, the idea of saying is believing as well, where the more we say something, this happens a lot with goal setting. And it's something that I was taught as well when I was first in my leadership role. And even when I was doing sports, when I was doing figure skating, there was a lot about visualization and writing down your goals, because the more you write it down, the more accountability there's going to be, the more you're going to believe it, the more that you're going to push forward and actually do it. And so again, all of these things tie into that aspect of influence. And specifically, here, as you can see, in a team setting, what can end up happening is questions can be tailored specifically to what the team believes. If the team believes, for instance, that this is going to be a really difficult, long assignment, then that may influence us to ask questions which supports and confirms that whole idea. And then even if we didn't believe it in the first place, we might then start to believe it. And the other thing that can happen is that we can also switch it the other way, where we start to influence other people by asking questions to get them to think along the same lines as what we're thinking. So there's, again, there's full of nuances with this whole idea of influence. And personally, I find it absolutely fascinating. And when I think back to my interactions and think back to projects I've worked on or assignments or teams that I've been a part of, and I reflect on how did I ask that? How did I frame this? Was I trying to approach this in a way to get a certain outcome, even though I wasn't the team leader? And so again, those first two questions I asked at the beginning, I hope you're keeping that in your mind, thinking, well, how much influence do I have, and how much influence do people have over me? There's this other idea of paying for influence. For instance, if you pay someone, does that then impact to speak? Does that then impact that person to align their speech closer with our belief system or our moral system or whatever may be going? And I think quite often we'll say, well, yes, of course, that's the whole point of us paying someone to come and talk, is to promote our ideas. However, think about it in a more grander scale. Think about it, for instance, with this is an election year. So politicians, we've got the provincial elections coming up in June. We've got municipal elections in October. So is there going to be opportunities, for instance, where people will be asked or will be given fundraising dollars towards their campaign? Are they going to actually speak on what they believe, or is there going to be that potential that they will shift and adjust their speeches based on what this group is paying them, or based on whomever they're speaking with? So again, as the audience, there's that opportunity to have influence on what is being said. Behavioral contagion. This is actually something that I found quite interesting. And it's the idea that people will repeat behavior after they see other people do it as well. So, I mean, in an extreme case, some of you may remember the film Single White Female, but there's this whole idea, and we often see this with teenagers or with friends or groups of people that will maybe start to dress together similarly, or they'll speak similarly, or they may take on mimic different people's nuances. This often happens with couples. For instance, I married a man from South Africa, and I've had people say since we've been married that sometimes some of my words have taken on different nuances. And this is something that's quite common, and I just never realized that there was an actual name for it. So I just wanted to draw your attention to this. And what this can also mean is that even though we may think that we are not in a position to have a direct impact on someone, we might be able to have a very indirect impact simply by being within the vicinity of other people, which could then inspire them to make big changes, not only at work, but maybe even in their personal life. And this is the whole idea of where birds of a feather flock together, where not only do people with similarities, common interests tend to group together and maybe spend more time together because they enjoy the same activities or they have similar ideas, but it also happens that perpetuates even more similarities because you're around the same people. So again, like I said, these are things that are often very intuitive that maybe, like myself, you'd never actually realize that there'd been studies done on this and that there was actual names for some of these behaviors. So I'm going to shift a little bit now about speaking. And something that I read recently is that some of the research out there has indicated that when we speak, only approximately 10% is actually remembered. So basically just the gist, the point, the overall point of what you're hearing. And so where this can have an impact and where this can influence people is that quite often we get very concerned about what we're going to say, how we're going to say it. I know it happens with me quite a bit, especially doing some of these webinars. I often get a little bit nervous about making sure that everything I'm saying is quite succinct, there's a logical flow. However, understanding that all of you on this webinar will probably only remember 10% of it, takes off some of the pressure and allows me to be able to just get through and make a point and actually say something. And so where this comes into play in this whole ambient influence side of things is that if we need to approach, for instance, our team leader, there is that challenge sometimes of being so concerned about being able to write the email properly or being able to say the right words that we spend so much more time fussing over that we don't just go and speak with them. Whereas if we just relaxed and just spoke more openly, then it might be able to happen a lot quicker. We might be able to get our point across a lot quicker and then spend that time elsewhere instead of being all so concerned about doing it perfectly. Pluralistic ignorance. I did reference this a little bit earlier. So this is the whole idea within social psychology where the minority group believes something about a topic and they think that that's actually what the majority of the group of people are thinking, or the other way around, where the majority of people think that their perception of a topic or their idea on this project really is the minority viewpoint. And so where this can really have an impact in our work as teams or on projects is that it can lead to groupthink, where, for instance, if I'm on a project team and I notice that there's some scope creep going on, or we're going a little off track from what the charter said, if I'm sitting there and believing that everybody else is seeing the same thing, but nobody else is saying anything, then it should be fine. Whereas by standing up and actually making a statement or asking a question, it could potentially break that cycle. And so again, having this little bit of influence there. Diffusion of responsibility. This is another one of these ideas where as the number of bystanders increases, the personal responsibility of that individual bystander feels decreases. So think about in for instance, a smoking room. There was a study done on this where they had people in the lobby of a hospital in a waiting room, and the room started to fill with smoke. And nobody moved, and because no one else moved, the participants in the study just assumed that everything was okay, even though they started coughing, even though they started to struggle. And so, for instance, you can also see this in emergencies. That happens when someone is on the street or something happens, or maybe someone falls down and nobody really relaxes because they feel like someone else will take care of it, so I don't need to take care of it. So again, this can impact us when we're at work, when we're in a team setting, by nobody really feeling as though they have to do something because there's so many people around, there's so many people on the team, someone must be taking care of it. So again, it's similar to the pluralistic ignorance. By stepping in and actually making a comment, by asking a question, by doing something, there's that immediate influence that happens towards other people that they will often start to take action as well. So here's another question for you. How many of you ever people watch? For me, this, I must admit, especially going on holidays and traveling, this is one of our favorite activities to do, is to sit in a cafe with a cup of coffee and just watch how people in another country, a different city, how they behave, what they do. Even sometimes here at home, we'll enjoy doing that, especially in the summertime when we're relaxing on the patio. And this idea of people watching is often underestimated. So, for instance, typically when we're sitting and we're watching, the people that we're watching generally don't believe that they are being watched as much as they are. And when you take a look at different roles, different occupations, it's most often the politicians or the public speakers that, or people that are in a visible sign of power or authority, they're the ones that typically recognize how often they are being watched. Whereas the rest of us, in our everyday lives, we underestimate this. And so where this can happen is if, for instance, if we understood how often people actually look at the way we react to others, actually, if we understand how often people look at, for instance, what we purchase, where we go, how we drive, how would that influence the way we behave, the way we speak, the way we dress, the way that we interact with others? So, for instance, again, when I was younger, when I was figure skating, I had a coach that would tell me that when I was out in public, to make sure that I presented myself well, because you never knew, I might come into contact with a judge that could influence their perception of me and their decision towards me in a future competition. And so just simply becoming aware. Another example very recently was last week. I had gone and spoken with a random neighbor in our neighborhood, and they made a comment about how they've been watching us do a bunch of renovations at our house for the last several years. So again, for me, understanding that and recognizing that will impact how I speak with other people or how I interact. Am I being welcoming? Am I being open to other people? Because that then will impact other people's perception of how they want to speak with me. So again, it's a huge, like I mentioned, this is a huge broad topic, and there's many nuances, there's many different elements and aspects to it. The liking gap is another one, that we tend to want to do more for people that we like. However, we tend to underestimate how much people actually like us. And so there was a study that I read about, a conversation study, and the conclusion was that there was a 12.5% liking gap. So people underestimated by 12.5% how much the person speaking with them actually liked them. Something else that was discovered from this study was that neutral observers to these conversations were actually much better at interpreting and at determining the percentage at which these two people liked each other based on the conversation they were having. So, what are the conclusions of this? Well, for instance, if you're sitting in a team meeting watching a conversation between two other people, you most likely have a better perspective on what is going on in that conversation, whether they're actually seeing eye to eye, whether they're missing something. So that puts you in a great position to be able to help with what's going on, with whatever is being discussed. Perhaps you, through that watching that conversation, perhaps you're able to see something that they're missing. And so you may be able to help to mitigate some kind of risk, or may be able to see whether perhaps doing this activity or doing this analysis will push us further ahead on this project or whatever it is that you're working on. And so also, by realizing that we tend to underestimate how much people like us and people tend to do more for people that they like, that also provides us with a little bit more influence. And so this is where we start to get into this whole idea, this fear of embarrassment, or of embarrassing people, or sorry, embarrassing some individual. And so again, this also gets increased when we become face to face with someone, whether that's over a Zoom, actually just seeing someone's face, or being in person with them. So for instance, if you're emailing someone, asking them for, let's say, a report or for some data or for them to stay late or to do something, it is much, much easier for them to say no or to disregard your request or to say, oh, sorry, it got lost in the mail, went to my junk folder, than it is to do that in person. And the reason for that is because on average, there's this fear of embarrassment that happens. And so again, we tend to underestimate how frequently people will agree to our requests. Just a quick little example here. Years ago, I was applying for a job at Good Life to be a sales associate there. And within the interview, what I had to do was to go down into Loblaws and get 5 people to sign up for a 1-week membership. The interviewer anticipated this would take about 20 minutes. I assumed I would have to ask 10 to 15 people. However, in reality, I believe I asked only 7 or 8 people in order to get 5 to agree, and it took me under 10 minutes to get this done. Because going into this situation, I underestimated how willing people would be to say yes. And so, again, think about when the last time you asked someone to help you with work, or again, like the example on the screen, to stay late or to give you some information that you needed in order to do your job. These are very common asks that we have, but sometimes what happens is because we may be afraid to ask, or we're afraid that they might say no, we might put in some adjectives to try and make the ask a little bit smoother. Oh, I know, I just have this tiny request. I just have this quick thing I'd like you to do. Whereas that isn't really necessary. And what it can do is it can unwittingly put people's heckles up, or get them to start to think, oh no, this is going to be a big deal. But again, just going forward and asking something face to face is much more influential than emailing or adding in all these additional adjectives. The self-perception theory is this whole idea of our behavior impacting what we actually believe instead of the other way around. And this is one that I hadn't really thought too much about, but again, it's very common. For instance, when I go to the stores, especially if I'm returning something, quite often I'll be asked for my personal information. And this is something that the majority of people will always willingly give. And I know that because when I've asked them why, I get this shocked, this confused look on their face as to, well, why are you asking me why I need your information? So again, it's this whole idea of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. And so this theory is that it's the egg that comes beforehand. We touched on this a little bit. Insinuation anxiety, the fear of suggesting other people are untrustworthy. So for instance, if you're in a team setting and someone volunteers and says, hey, let me take the lead on this aspect of the project or on doing this process mapping, there is commonly this fear of thinking, well, if I say no, they're going to then think, that team member will think that I believe they're incompetent, so I'll just say yes. So all of these can impact, all of these little nuances impact either side of the scale, whether you are the person in power and authority or whether you're not. So just to wrap up here, I know we've gone a couple minutes overhand, and I thank you for sticking with us. So I just have this question: do you unknowingly exert influence? And how are you doing that? So for instance, when you're speaking, here are some questions for you to consider. When you're behaving, what you're actually doing, some other questions for you to consider. Are these things giving influence, or are you exerting influence over other people? And if you didn't do these, or if you framed them a different way, if you approach situations slightly differently, would that increase or decrease your influence? So as I've said several times, this is a very big area, big broad topic, and it's something that I personally will be looking into probably for the rest of my career because I find it quite interesting. And as we get to understand human behavior a little bit better, then I think some of these will also shift and adjust. So just in a summary, we do have influence in all these areas, whether we're asking questions, whether we're asking for help, whether we're a participant in a group, whether we're listening. And it's important for us to actually understand how all of this works and how we can have influence so that we are not taking advantage of people, so that we are continuing to be ethical and moral in our interactions and we're not manipulating people. So if you do want to dig deeper, a couple of potential resources, Robert Cialdini, he's got the 6 principles of persuasion. This is often more from a leadership perspective, but again, if you're not in that position, then these are really some interesting principles to dig in a little bit deeper. From my personal library, these are some of the books that I've read on the topic. I find them quite interesting, especially the You Have More Influence Than You Think by Vanessa Bohns. And then if you want to have a bit more formal education on this or professional development, we do have an upcoming course in June called Influence Without Authority, which will be facilitated by Tony White. So if you do want a bit more information on this, definitely send us a note. These are some references I'm going to be sending out to everybody to dig a little bit deeper into the topic. And then if you're interested in, again, any continuing education or coaching, this is just a snapshot of some of the programs and services that we offer. Emotional intelligence is also another great way to understand influence a little bit better and your own personal emotions and being able to recognize that in other people. So with that, we've come to the end of our time together. So once again, I thank you for sticking around, and I hope that everybody has a great afternoon.